Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Lurker. I can imagine some of you are lying in bed, maybe scrolling late at night. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. If you're new, consider subscribing. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm really happy to have you back, my friend. Now, get comfortable, and let me tell you tonight's park ranger story. There's a particular kind of silence you only find above the tree line. I don't mean quiet. Quiet is what you get on a suburban street at 2 in the morning, or in a library, or in the pause between songs. Quiet is the absence of noise. What I'm talking about is different. It's a presence, a pressure. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that settles against your eardrums like cotton packed too tight, until you start to hear things that aren't sounds at all. The blood in your own temples, the faint wet click of your jaw when you swallow, the nearly subsonic hum of your own nervous system doing its thankless work. That's what greeted me every evening in the lookout. 7,200 feet above sea level, perched on a ridge in the Bitterroot National Forest. And the silence up there wasn't peaceful. It was complete, a finished thing. The kind of silence that makes you understand why monks seek it out and why some of them lose their minds. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand the container before I describe what filled it. And because this story doesn't work if you're expecting something loud. The nights had a ritual to them. The sun would drop behind the Selway Bitterroot Ridge, and the light would go from gold to copper to a bruised violet that only lasted about 9 minutes before the dark came in. Not gradually. It arrived. One moment I could see the drainage below me, the black spruce and the lodgepole pine crowding the creek beds, and the next moment all of that was gone, and there was only the glass of the cab windows reflecting my propane lantern back at me in every direction, turning the lookout into a small, bright box, hanging in nothing. I'd hear the wind first, not strong up there in late August, but steady, a constant low push against the northwest windows that made the old timber frame groan in a rhythm I came to know, as well as my own breathing. Then the creaking of the catwalk as the temperature dropped and the bolts contracted. Then the soft hiss of the lantern, which was the last sound the world offered me before it went totally still. I want to be honest with you from the start. What I'm about to tell you is not dramatic. It's not fast. If you're looking for something that lunges at you from the dark, this isn't it. The truth, in my experience, has always been quieter than that. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. And by the time you recognize it, it's already been sitting with you for a while. So that's what I'm asking. A little patience. A willingness to sit in the silence with me, the way I sat in it alone for 31 nights in that tower before the silence started to change. My name is Elliot Marsh. I was 34 years old the summer I took the lookout posting, and I'd been with the Forest Service for 11 years by then, most of them on the fire side. I started on a hand crew out of Missoula when I was 23, young enough to think the work was romantic, and old enough to know better but not care. Hotshot crew by 26, saw my first major complex fire that same year. A 12,000-acre burn in the Frank Church that ate a drainage and a half before we got ahead of it. By 29, I was a squad boss, running a Type 1 crew through the worst fire seasons on record, back-to-back years where the smoke columns looked like thunderheads, and the air quality index in town stayed in the hazardous range for weeks. I was good at it, not because I was brave. I want to be clear about that. Bravery had very little to do with it. I was good at it because I was methodical, because I could read terrain and fuel loads and weather patterns and make decisions under pressure that were boring and correct. The best decisions on a fire line are boring ones. You dig here, not there. You pull back now, not in 10 minutes. You take the long route around because the short one puts you below a chimney. Boring keeps people alive. Davis Quinn was my Sawyer. We'd worked together for 6 seasons, which in fire terms is something close to a marriage. He was 5 years older than me, quieter than me, funnier than me when he did talk. He had a way of cutting line that was almost meditative, steady, efficient, never wasted a stroke. Off the fire line he was the same, measured, present, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, you didn't have to ask him to repeat himself because you were already paying attention. I'm not going to tell you about the burnover yet. Not all of it, just enough so you understand why. In April of the following year, I walked into the district ranger's office and asked for the most remote lookout posting available for the summer season. I wasn't running from anything. That's what I told myself, and for a while I believed it. The therapist the Forest Service assigned me after the incident review used words like avoidance and complicated grief, and I sat in her office and nodded and agreed with her terminology and went home and packed a bag. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to process it. I wanted to go somewhere high and far away and sit in the silence and do a job that required only my eyes and my radio and none of the parts of me that were broken. The lookout felt medicinal. That's the word I kept coming back to. Not punishment, not exile, medicine. The way a fever breaks when you finally stop fighting it and just lie still. I thought if I could be still enough, for long enough, something inside me would cool and harden, and I could come back down the mountain in September as a functional person. That was the plan. Go up broken, come down fixed, simple, clean. The kind of boring, correct decision I'd built my whole career on. Carol Voss had been the district ranger for the Bitterroot for 14 years when I sat across from her desk that April. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with short grey hair and the kind of direct eye contact that made you feel like she was reading a report printed on the inside of your skull. She had my personnel file open in front of her, and she'd clearly read every page of it, including the incident review. You understand this isn't a recovery posting, she said, not a question. I understand. Because we've had people request remote assignments for the wrong reasons, and it doesn't go well for them. Isolation amplifies whatever you bring into it. I told her I understood that too. I told her I'd been cleared for duty. I told her I wanted the work. She studied me for a long time. Carol had a way of being silent that wasn't uncomfortable. It was evaluative. She was running calculations behind those eyes, and she wasn't going to speak until the math was done. Sleeping well? She asked. Well enough. Eating? Yes. Drinking? No more than before. She nodded slowly. The posting I have is Granite Peak. It's our most remote lookout. 14 miles from the nearest trailhead, no vehicle access. Resupply by mule train every 2 weeks. The last seasonal we had up there quit in July. Quit. Walked off the mountain mid-season. Left personal effects behind. Sleeping bag, books, half his gear. Just packed what he could carry and hiked out to the trailhead and called for a pickup. Did he say why? Carol looked at me and something shifted in her expression. Not concern exactly, something closer to consideration, like she was deciding how much to share. He didn't say much of anything. Filed his separation paperwork, collected his last check, and that was it. She paused. I'll be straight with you, Elliot. Granite Peak is a good posting for someone who wants solitude. The views are outstanding, the fire risk is moderate, and the work is straightforward. But it's remote in a way that goes beyond distance. Something about that ridge. People either settle into it or they don't. I told her I'd settle. She closed my file and stood, which I took as the end of the interview. At the door, she put a hand on the frame and said, without turning all the way around, "The tower tells you when it's time to leave. Don't wait too long to listen." I didn't ask what that meant. I wish I could say it stuck with me, rattled around in my head on the hike in. But it didn't. It landed the way vague warnings always land when you're certain they don't apply to you. Heard, noted, immediately filed under things other people need to worry about. The hike in took 2 days. 14 miles of trail that gained 4,000 feet of elevation over its length, switching back through old-growth cedar along the creek bottom before climbing into a Douglas fir and lodgepole mix, then thinning to subalpine fir and whitebark pine near the ridge. The last mile was above the tree line entirely, bare granite and low scrub, and a wind that didn't let up for a single step. The tower appeared exactly where the topo map said it would, sitting on the highest point of the ridge, like a lighthouse with no ocean. It was an older model, a 14 by 14 cab on a 40-foot timber and steel frame, with a wraparound catwalk, a staircase that zigzagged up the structure in 3 flights, and windows on all 4 sides. The Forest Service had maintained it well enough. The glass was intact, the frame was solid, and the cab was stocked with everything on the inventory list Carol had given me. I spent the first morning unpacking and organizing. The cab held a cot, a small table, a propane stove, the fire finder on its central pedestal, a 2-way radio, a weather station kit, and shelf space for food and personal gear. It was tight quarters, but I'd spent seasons sleeping in fire camps and spike camps in the back of crew buggies, so a room with 4 walls and a solid floor felt almost luxurious. By noon, I had the weather station calibrated and had taken my first observation. Temperature 67, humidity 31%, wind northwest at 8, visibility unrestricted. I logged it in the official book and radioed it in to dispatch. A woman named Linda answered, voice like a schoolteacher, patient and precise. She confirmed receipt and told me my check-in schedule. Morning observation at 0700, afternoon at 1300, evening at 1900. The Osborne firefinder sat in the center of the cab like an altar. If you've never seen one, it's a sighting device mounted on a rotating table with a topographic map built into it. You spot smoke, align the crosshairs, read the azimuth off the ring, and radio it in. Dispatch triangulates with another lookout or a patrol unit and sends a crew. It's simple, analog, and it works. I practiced with it that first afternoon, sighting landmarks I could identify from the map. A bald ridge to the south, a creek junction to the northwest, a radio repeater tower on a distant peak. The routine established itself quickly. I'd wake at 6, boil water for coffee, take the morning observation, radio it in, scan the horizon in a slow 360 with binoculars, checking each drainage and ridgeline for the faintest wisp of smoke, log everything, eat, read, scan again, take the afternoon observation, explore the immediate area around the tower base if the weather was good, evening observation, cook dinner, read by lantern light until the dark came in and the silence settled. By the 4th day, I'd stopped hearing the silence as silence. It became the baseline, the default. My world was the cab, the catwalk, the stairs, the small clearing at the base of the tower, and a 360-degree view that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Everything I needed was inside that perimeter. Everything I was trying not to think about was somewhere below, down in the valleys and the towns and the world I'd left behind. For one full week, it worked exactly the way I'd hoped it would. The mountains gave me nothing but distance and weather and the slow, indifferent turning of days, and I gave them nothing but my attention. I started thinking about Davis on the 7th evening, not because of anything that triggered it. That's what people expect. A song, a smell, something that unlocks the memory like a key. But grief isn't that precise. It's more like water. It finds the cracks on its own schedule, fills whatever space you leave unguarded. I was sitting on the catwalk with my boots on the railing, watching the last light pull back from the valley, and suddenly Davis was there. Not literally, but the weight of him, the shape of his absence, which after 14 months had become its own familiar presence. We met on a crew transport, heading to a fire in the Lolo, stuffed into the back of a truck with 12 other guys and all our gear. He was reading a paperback, some old Lurker novel. The spine cracked so deep you could barely read the title. He didn't talk to anyone for the first hour. When he finally did, it was to ask me if I'd brought any extra bootlaces, because one of his had snapped during the loadout. I had. He said thanks. That was the beginning of it. 6 seasons we worked together. 6 fire years. That's thousands of hours of shared labor, shared meals, shared silences on the line when the work was too hard or too dangerous for conversation. I learned his rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of a landscape you walk through every day. I knew when he was tired by the way his saw pulled. I knew when he was worried by the way he checked the sky. Not once, but twice, 3 times, like he was waiting for the weather to confirm something he already felt. He was married, had a daughter, Clara, who was 7 when he died. His wife, Karen, sent me a card after the memorial service. It said, "He always said you were the best boss he ever worked for." I put it in a drawer and didn't look at it again for months. The burnover happened on August 14th. I'm going to tell you what I can, which isn't everything. Not because the details are classified. The incident review is public record if you want to find it. But because some of what happened in those 11 minutes exists in my memory as sensation rather than sequence. Heat, sound, the way the air turned orange and then went dark. The radio traffic that I can still recite from memory if I'm tired enough and careless enough to let it play. What matters is this: I made a decision, and the decision was correct. We pulled back to our safety zone. We deployed shelters. We followed protocol exactly. And Davis still died, because a spot fire jumped the line behind us and cut off the route to his position, and the shelter he deployed had a defective seam, and the temperature in that drainage exceeded what the aluminum could withstand. Correct decisions don't always produce correct outcomes. That's the thing they don't tell you in training. They teach you the protocols and the procedures and the decision trees, and all of it is built on the assumption that if you do everything right, the math works out. But fire isn't math. Fire is physics and chemistry and weather and terrain, and sometimes it doesn't care how right you are. I sat on that catwalk and watched the dark arrive, and I let myself think about him for the first time since I'd climbed the tower. Just sat with it. Didn't try to redirect my thoughts or manage my breathing or do any of the things the therapist had taught me. Just let him be there, the way he used to be. Quiet, steady, present. It wasn't peace, but it was something close to honest. The dark at 7,000 feet is a different animal than the dark you know. There's no light pollution up there, no ambient glow on the horizon from a town 20 miles away, no car headlights threading through a distant valley, no porch lights or street lights or the faint orange haze that hovers over every populated place on Earth. When the moon is down and the clouds are low, the dark is absolute. It has texture. It has depth. You can almost feel it against your skin, cool and faintly electric, like the air before a storm. Your eyes never fully adjust. That's the thing people don't realize. They think if you sit in the dark long enough, you'll start to see. And you do a little. Starlight will give you the faintest suggestion of shapes, the ridge lines, the tower railing. But it's not sight. It's memory. Your brain filling in what it already knows is there. So your ears take over. And up there, in that silence, your hearing becomes something almost uncomfortably acute. You hear the catwalk contracting as the metal cools. You hear the woodwork settling. You hear a beetle moving across the floor from 6 feet away, its legs ticking on the plywood like a tiny clock. On the 8th night, I was lying in my cot with the lantern off, listening to the tower do its nighttime arithmetic of creaks and ticks, when I heard something beneath me. Not the frame settling. I knew that sound by then. Not the wind. The wind was calm that night. I'd logged it at my evening observation. Southwest at 3, barely a breath. This was different. It came from the base of the structure, down where the support beams met the concrete footings. And it sounded like something dragging across wood, a slow, deliberate rasp. 3 seconds of it, maybe 4, and then it stopped. I lay there and listened. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal. A porcupine, maybe, gnawing on the treated wood for the salt. They do that. It's common. I'd seen the damage on other structures during my years in the forest. I rolled over and closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep for a long time. And somewhere in the hours that followed, in the deepest part of that dark, I thought I heard it again. Not the rasping this time, but something lower and more rhythmic. A creak, then another, then silence, like weight being applied to wood and then released, like a test, like someone placing a foot on the bottom stair and then taking it away. I didn't get up. I didn't turn on my light. I lay in the dark, and I listened. And eventually whatever it was either stopped or I finally slept. And in the morning the sun came through the east windows, and the valley was green and golden and real. And I made my coffee, and took my observation and didn't think about it again. Not right away. The morning after, I followed my routine with the kind of deliberate attention you give to ordinary tasks when part of you would rather not think about why you slept badly. Coffee, observation, radio check-in. Temperature 51 at dawn, warming fast. Humidity dropping. Good visibility, fire weather. It was during my perimeter walk that I noticed them. I did a perimeter walk every 2 or 3 days, just a circuit around the base of the tower, checking the footings, the ground anchors, the tool cache in its locked box at the bottom of the stairs. Standard maintenance. The kind of task you do on autopilot because there's never anything to find. The scratch marks were on the northwest support beam, about 4 feet off the ground. 4 parallel gouges, vertical, running from roughly waist height down to the base. Deep enough that the weathered surface of the timber had been torn away to reveal fresh wood beneath, pale and almost white against the grey. I crouched and ran my fingers over them. The wood was splintered outward, which told me whatever made them had dragged downward with considerable force. They were evenly spaced, too evenly really for a bear. A black bear's claws splay when they rake, and the marks they leave tend to fan out from a central point. These were parallel, almost ruled like lines drawn with a straight edge. I took 3 photographs with my personal camera and noted the location and dimensions in my log. Bear activity probable, possible marking behavior, or attempt to access the structure. I'd mention it on my next radio check-in. There were bears in every drainage in the Bitterroot, and they investigated anything that smelled like food or salt or human habitation. Still, I stood there longer than I needed to. Something about the precision of those marks held me. Bears are strong, but they're also messy. These gouges looked like they'd been made by something that knew exactly where its claws were. Something controlled, deliberate. I shook it off, wrote it down, moved on. The rest of the morning was unremarkable. I cleaned the cab, swept the catwalk, took my afternoon observation. The sky was clean and hot, and the drainages below shimmered with heat haze. If there were fires starting out there, I'd see the smoke within minutes. That was my job. Watch, report, let someone else do the rest. It was a good job for a man who'd lost his nerve for doing the rest. The afternoon check-in with Linda went the way they always did. Observation data, condition summary, any notable activity. I read off my numbers, she confirmed receipt, and then, almost as an afterthought, I mentioned the scratch marks. Bear activity at the tower base, I said. Northwest support beam. Fresh marks, maybe overnight. 4 parallel vertical gouges, approximately 4 feet in length. There was a pause. Not long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. But I'd been talking to Linda twice a day for over a week by then, and she wasn't a woman who paused. Which leg? She asked. Northwest. Another pause. I heard her pen stop moving. In the background, the dispatch center hummed with its usual low chatter. Other radios, other voices, the faint beep of the computer system. Copy that, she said. We've had bear activity in that drainage all summer. Make sure your food cache is secure and your trash is sealed. Already is. Good. Tomorrow's forecast is showing a ridge of high pressure building through the weekend. Fire weather watch likely by Thursday. I'll pass along the details at your morning check-in. And that was it. She moved on. Crisp, professional, on to the next item. But she'd asked which leg. Not how high, not how fresh, not whether I'd seen tracks or scat. The things you'd normally ask to assess whether a bear was likely to be a problem. She'd asked which leg, as if the location mattered, as if there was a correct answer and an incorrect answer, and my response had landed on the wrong side. I almost called her back, almost keyed the mic and said, Linda, why did you ask that? But I didn't, because the question felt paranoid. And paranoia was the one thing I couldn't afford up there. Paranoia is the mind's way of manufacturing company when there's no one around to check your thinking. And I'd promised Carol and my therapist and myself that if I started talking to shadows, I'd pack my bag and walk down the mountain. So I let it go. I logged the exchange. I noted in my personal shorthand at the margin of the page a single question mark. It appeared 3 days later. Or rather, I became aware of it 3 days later. I can't be certain it wasn't there before, and I simply hadn't been in the right place at the right time to catch it. Late afternoon, the sun just starting its long slide toward the ridge. I was at the base of the tower, refilling my water jugs from the rain collection barrel when I caught it. A smell. Not strong, not overwhelming, but distinct enough that it stopped me mid-pour and made me straighten up and turn my head trying to triangulate. It was sweet. That was the first thing. Sweet the way tree sap is sweet when it bleeds from a fresh wound in the bark. That resinous, almost syrupy quality. But underneath the sweetness was something else, something metallic, like copper or old blood. The two notes didn't belong together. Sap and copper, sugar and iron. It was the smell equivalent of a chord played wrong. Familiar notes arranged in a combination that your brain flags as incorrect before you can even articulate why. I set the water jug down and walked the perimeter of the tower base, breathing slowly through my nose. The smell was strongest near the northwest support beam, the same beam with the scratch marks, and it faded rapidly as I moved away. Within 20 feet it was gone entirely. I searched the ground. Nothing. No carcass, no scat, no mineral deposit, no leaking container in the tool cache. I checked the beam itself, thinking maybe the gouges had exposed some treated layer of the wood that was off-gassing in the heat. The marks were there, unchanged, and they smelled like nothing. Plain wood. The next evening, same time, same location. There it was again, sap and copper, and the evening after that. Always at dusk, always concentrated at the base, always gone by the time full dark arrived, as if whatever produced it evaporated with the last light. I started documenting it. Time of onset, duration, apparent source, weather conditions. I applied every rational framework I had. Chemical reaction in the soil triggered by temperature change. Fungal bloom on the timber. Some species of plant I wasn't recognizing. Decomposition of something buried and too deep to see. None of these explanations fit perfectly, but none of them were impossible. And that's what I clung to. The possible, the explainable. Because the alternative was that something was coming to the base of my tower every evening, and leaving behind a scent that didn't match any animal or plant or mineral I'd encountered in 11 years of working in these mountains. And that alternative was not something I was ready to sit with. I found Sean Purcell's logbook on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I'd started marking the days on my calendar with small X's, the way you do when you're counting towards something, even though I wasn't sure what I was counting toward. I was cleaning behind the firefinder cabinet, a task born more of boredom than necessity, when my hand closed around a small hardbound notebook that had slipped between the cabinet's base and the wall. It was standard issue. Green cover, Forest Service emblem, the kind they hand out to every seasonal for field notes. The name on the inside cover, written in careful block letters, was Sean Purcell, and below it, Granite Peak Lookout, and below that, the year. I should have turned it in. Procedure says any personal effects left by a previous employee get logged and returned through the district office. I knew that. But I sat down at the table and opened it anyway, because I was alone and bored, and because some part of me, the part that had been lying awake listening to sounds I couldn't explain, wanted to know what Sean Purcell had written in the weeks before he walked off this mountain. The early entries were meticulous. Daily observations, weather data, visibility conditions, fire activity. June 1st through June 30th was a model logbook, the kind of record keeping that would make any district ranger proud. Sean wrote in a clean, compact hand, and his notes had a precision that suggested either a military background or an engineering mind. He recorded everything: the time he spotted a bull elk in the north drainage, the date the alpine wildflowers bloomed on the south slope, the exact azimuth of a lightning strike he observed on June 19th. July was where it changed. The entries from the first week of July were shorter, still accurate, still professional, but pared down. Just the data, none of the observational detail. By the second week, the handwriting had loosened. Not sloppy, but faster, as though he was writing under some mild pressure he hadn't felt before. July 11th. Heard something under the tower last night. Checked at dawn. Marks on northwest beam. July 13th. Smell at dusk again. Cannot identify source. Not animal. July 15th. Movement on the structure at night. Staircase. Could not determine cause. July 16th. Staircase again. Louder. Closer. July 17th. It stops on the landing. The entries after that were fragments. Single lines, some of them barely legible. July 18th. Why does it stop? July 19th. The final entry, written in letters that pressed so hard they'd nearly torn through the page. It knows I can hear it. Nothing after that. The remaining pages were blank. I closed the book and sat with it in my hands for a long time. The cab was quiet. The afternoon sun came through the south windows and laid a warm rectangle across the table and across my fingers and across the green cover of Sean Purcell's abandoned record of something he couldn't explain and couldn't endure. Northwest beam. Smell at dusk. Movement on the staircase. Stopping on the landing. Every detail matched. I'm going to tell you what I told myself because I think it matters. I think it matters that I didn't panic, that I sat at that table with Sean Purcell's logbook, and I did what 11 years of wildland fire training had taught me to do. I assessed the situation, identified variables, and built a rational model that accounted for the evidence. The scratch marks, porcupines, common on Forest Service structures. They chew treated wood for the mineral salts. 4 parallel marks could easily be the drag pattern of a large porcupine's claws as it climbed. The smell, off-gassing from the foundation treatment. Creosote or copper-based preservative reacting with soil moisture and temperature differential at dusk. Unusual but not unprecedented. The staircase sounds. Thermal contraction of the steel and timber hybrid frame. The tower was 40 feet tall and exposed to significant temperature swings between day and night. Metal contracts when it cools. Wood shifts. The resulting sounds could easily mimic a rhythmic pattern if the structure's stress points were distributed at regular intervals. Sean Purcell's logbook, a young seasonal with limited backcountry experience, posted alone to an extremely remote site, developing anxiety-driven hypervigilance that turned ordinary environmental phenomena into a threatening narrative. It happens. Isolation does that. Carol had practically warned me about it. I lined up these explanations and examined them, and they held. They weren't perfect. The evenness of the scratch marks still nagged at me, and the smell didn't quite track with any preservative I'd encountered, but they were sufficient. They were within the bounds of what was possible, and in my experience, possible is where the truth almost always lives. I radioed Carol that evening on the satellite phone, kept it professional, mentioned I'd found Sean Purcell's logbook, and asked if she wanted me to pack it out with my gear or if she'd like it on the next resupply. "Hold on to it," she said. "I'll note it for the file." Carol, can I ask, did Sean say anything when he left about why? A long breath on the other end. He said he wasn't sleeping, said the posting wasn't a good fit. I didn't push him on it. When someone tells you they need to leave, you let them leave. That's it? That's it. He was a good kid, bright, just wasn't suited for the solitude. She paused. You doing okay up there, Elliot? I'm fine. Good. Keep your check-ins on schedule and call me if anything changes. I said I would. I put the satellite phone back in its case. I made dinner, I read, I went to bed. And I told myself, with the full authority of a man who had spent his entire adult life making rational assessments in irrational conditions, that there was nothing on this mountain that couldn't be explained. It came back at 21:14. I know the time because I'd been lying awake watching the faint green glow of my wristwatch. Not because I was waiting for something, but because sleep had become a negotiation rather than a surrender. My body wanted rest. My mind wanted to listen. And so I lay there in the compromise between them, eyes open in the dark, hearing the tower's familiar nighttime vocabulary of ticks and groans. The first creak came from the bottom of the staircase. I felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that traveled up through the frame and into the cab floor and into the cot frame and into my spine, the specific tremor of weight on wood. 3 beats, a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate. 3 more beats. I stopped breathing. The pattern repeated. 3 and 3 and 3. Not fast, measured, steady, with the unhurried rhythm of something that was in no rush. Something ascending. I lay perfectly still and tracked the sound. It was climbing. I could tell by the way the vibration changed as the source moved higher along the structure. The lower stairs had a deeper resonance, the upper ones a tighter, more contained creak. It passed the first flight. It reached the turn. Then it stopped, right at the midpoint landing. Silence. Not the absence of sound, the presence of waiting. As if whatever was on that landing had paused to listen, the same way I was listening. A mutual awareness, separated by 20 feet of timber and air and the thin floor of the cab. I didn't move, didn't reach for my flashlight, didn't go to the trap door. I lay in my cot, and I held my breath, and I listened to the silence listen back. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. Time does strange things when your body is flooded with adrenaline and your conscious mind is trying very hard to remain in charge. Long enough for my heartbeat to become audible in my own ears. Long enough for my fingers to cramp from gripping the edge of the cot. Then the silence softened. The waiting quality left it. The tower settled back into its ordinary nighttime sounds. And whatever had been on the landing was either gone or so still that it had become indistinguishable from the structure itself. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark until dawn grayed the windows and the valley materialized below me, real and green and ordinary. And I got up and made coffee and took my observation and radioed it in with a voice that sounded, I thought, almost entirely steady. I gave myself one day of normalcy, of routine, of deliberate disengagement from the thing I was not yet willing to name as a problem. I took my observations. I scanned the horizon. I ate my meals and read my book and walked the catwalk in the afternoon sun. And I did not go down to the base of the tower, and I did not look at the northwest support beam, and I did not open Sean Purcell's logbook. By the following evening, the pretending was exhausting, and I decided to do what I do best. I decided to be methodical. The duct tape was in the toolkit, a standard roll, nothing special. I tore it into strips about 8 inches long, narrow enough to span a single stair tread without being visible from more than a few feet away. Starting at the bottom of the staircase, I laid one strip across each tread, pressing the ends down firmly against the wood so they'd hold in the light breeze, but would snap or pull free under any real weight. 22 stairs in total, divided by 2 landings into 3 flights. I taped every one. Then I stood at the bottom and looked up at my work and felt profoundly stupid. This was the kind of thing a child would do. A kid who'd watched too many spy movies. Lay a trap for the monster. Check it in the morning. I was a 34-year-old federal employee with a decade of emergency management experience, and I was setting tripwires on my own staircase because I'd heard some creaking in the dark. But I did it anyway, because the part of me that was trained to assess, to verify, to trust evidence over assumption, that part needed data. If the tape was undisturbed in the morning, then thermal contraction it was. I could close the book on the whole thing and focus on the only job that mattered, which was watching for fire. I climbed back up, entered the cab, and closed the trap door. I cooked dinner. I logged the setup in my official record, using language so dry and clinical it could have come from an engineering report. Placed adhesive indicators on stair treads to monitor for wildlife activity on structure. Will assess at dawn. Then I turned off the lantern and lay down in my cot and listened to the dark. At 9:14, the staircase began to speak. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. I didn't move. I just listened as the sound climbed, steady and sure, past the first flight, up to the landing, and stopped. And I lay there until morning. The sun woke me, which meant I'd slept at some point, though I didn't remember the transition. I lay in the cot for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling the particular heaviness that comes from a night spent mostly awake and partly afraid. Then I got up, put on my boots, opened the trapdoor, and went down. The bottom flight of stairs, treads 1 through 6, was undisturbed. Every strip of tape lay exactly where I'd placed it, edges pressed flat, adhesive intact. Whatever had come to the tower in the night had not started at the bottom. Stair 7 was different. The tape was broken cleanly, not peeled or weathered or curled by moisture, but snapped. The 2 halves lay on the tread with a gap between them, the break sharp and precise. 8, broken. 9, broken. All the way up to 14, the last stair before the midpoint landing. Every strip snapped the same way from above, as though something had descended onto each tread with enough weight to break the tape, but not enough violence to displace the pieces. Deliberate. Controlled. I crouched on the landing and examined it. The wood was clean, no tracks, no claw marks, no scratches, no fur caught on splinters, no scat on any surface. Nothing biological, nothing that would tell me an animal had been here. I looked down at the tape on stair 6, intact, and up at the tape on stair 7, broken, and tried to reconcile the evidence with any explanation that didn't require me to abandon rationality entirely. An animal that could reach the 7th stair without touching the first 6. An animal heavy enough to snap tape but light enough to leave no trace. An animal that climbed to a midpoint and stopped. I went back down to the base and circled the support structure. The scratch marks on the northwest beam were deeper. Not dramatically, not overnight transformation deep, but measurably. I'd photographed them 4 days earlier. I photographed them again now and compared the images on the camera's small screen. The gouges had lengthened by perhaps 2 inches and widened by a fraction. Fresh wood shone at the bottom of each groove. Something was gripping that beam. Something was climbing the stairs from the 7th tread to the 14th. Something was stopping on the landing and waiting in the dark. And whatever it wasn't a porcupine. I radioed in my morning observation with the same flat professionalism I'd used every day since my posting began. Temperature, humidity, wind, visibility. Linda confirmed receipt. I almost left it there. Linda, one more thing. I'm still seeing evidence of wildlife activity on the structure, more extensive than previously reported. Requesting any guidance on deterrent measures. Copy, Granite Peak. I'll pass it along to wildlife management. Any visual confirmation of species? Negative. No visual, no tracks, no scat. Understood. We'll flag it. Anything else? Negative. Granite Peak out. It was during the afternoon check-in that the radio went wrong. I keyed the mic at 1300 and began reading my observation, and beneath Linda's acknowledgement, beneath the familiar hiss of the carrier wave, I heard something else. A tone. Low, steady, oscillating at a frequency that sat right at the threshold of perception. Not quite a hum, not quite a vibration, but something in between. It reminded me of the sound you hear when you press your ear against a power line pole, that deep electromagnetic murmur. I adjusted the squelch. The tone persisted. I switched to the backup frequency. Still there. I tried 3 other channels. On every one beneath the static or the silence, that same low oscillation. Linda, I'm getting some interference on my end. Low frequency tone across all channels. Are you showing anything on your side? A pause. Negative. Granite Peak. Signal looks clean here. What kind of tone? Steady, low-pitched, oscillating. Almost subsonic. It's under your voice, not over it. I'm not hearing anything unusual. Could be atmospheric. There's a temperature inversion building over the valley. Sometimes plays tricks with radio propagation. Copy. I'll monitor. I let it go. The tone faded during the afternoon, and by my evening check-in it was gone. I noted it in the log. Radio interference, possible atmospheric, and ate my dinner and tried to read. And at exactly 9:14 the radio, which I had turned off, emitted the tone. Not static, not a power fluctuation. The radio was off. The power switch was in the down position, and from the speaker came that same low, steady oscillation, barely audible, more felt than heard, as if the device were picking up something that didn't require electricity to arrive. It lasted 6 seconds. I counted them. Then it stopped, and from beneath the cab floor came the first creak of the staircase. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. I sat at the table with my hands flat on the wood, and I listened to them climb. The camera was a small digital point-and-shoot I'd brought for personal use. Wildflowers, sunsets, the kind of beauty shots you take when you're alone in a place that seems too extraordinary not to document. It had a timer function and a flash, and the next evening I carried it out to the catwalk and spent 20 minutes figuring out how to rig it. I used a bungee cord to strap it to the catwalk railing, angled downward toward the staircase. I set the timer to take 1 photograph every 15 minutes, from 2100 to 0400. The flash would fire automatically. 42 frames. If anything was on those stairs, I'd have it. I went inside, closed the trapdoor, and waited. The evening passed with its usual decelerating rhythm. Light to dusk to dark, silence to wind to silence. Every 15 minutes, through the glass of the northwest window, I saw the brief white flare of the flash firing, illuminating the catwalk and the top of the staircase in a split-second burst that left green after-images floating in my vision. At 9:14 the tone rose from the dead radio. At 9:14 and perhaps 30 seconds, the staircase began. I listened as the pattern climbed. 3 beats, pause, methodical and sure. Past the point where my tape had broken, up toward the landing. It stopped. It waited. I waited with it. Sometime after midnight, I slept. In the morning, I retrieved the camera with hands that were not entirely steady. I sat on the catwalk in the early sun and scrolled through the images. Frame after frame of empty stairs, slightly overexposed by the flash, the timber treads and metal railing rendered in harsh white and deep shadow. The composition was identical in each one. The same angle, the same emptiness, the same geometry of a staircase going nowhere. Until frame 23, time-stamped 0217. The stairs were not empty. On the midpoint landing there was a shadow. I don't mean the absence of light. The flash was direct and bright and left very few shadows in any of the other frames. I mean a shape, a darkness that occupied space. It was tall, extending from the landing floor nearly to the underside of the next flight above it. And it was narrow, not human narrow, but wrong narrow, a proportion that my eyes kept trying to correct because it didn't conform to any body plan I recognized. It had no clear edges. It didn't reflect the flash the way a solid object should. It looked like a hole in the photograph, a place where the image simply stopped providing information. I stared at it for a long time. I zoomed in until the pixels broke apart into meaningless blocks of color. I zoomed back out and looked at the frames on either side, 22 and 24, 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after, and both showed empty stairs. Whatever it was had been on the landing for less than 15 minutes, or it had only been visible for the single moment the flash caught it, or it existed in a way that the camera could almost but not quite record. I saved the image. I turned the camera off. I did not set it up again that night. I used the satellite phone because I wanted a private channel. The radio felt compromised, and I wasn't willing to discuss what I'd seen and heard and photographed on a frequency that Linda or anyone else in the dispatch center might overhear. Not because I was ashamed, because I didn't yet have the language for it, and I wasn't going to sound like a man who'd lost his grip until I was sure I hadn't. Carol answered on the third ring. I could hear wind on her end, which meant she was outside, probably at the district compound, walking between buildings the way she always did when she took calls, too restless to sit at her desk. Elliot, everything all right? I want to report some observations and get your assessment. I kept my voice level. Used the incident reporting cadence I'd used 100 times on fire assignments. Facts first, interpretation second, emotion nowhere. I told her about the scratch marks, the progression, the depth, the staircase sounds, their timing, their pattern, the tape experiment and its results, the radio tone. I did not mention the photograph. I wasn't ready to share that yet. Carol listened without interrupting. That was her way. She took information in completely before she processed it, like a computer running a batch file. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long time. You sound clear-headed, she said finally. I am. And you've ruled out wildlife? I can't confirm wildlife. No tracks, no scat, no hair, no visual. The physical evidence doesn't match any species I'm familiar with. Another pause. Elliot, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as information, not as a reason to stay or leave. That's your decision. Go ahead. Sean Purcell wasn't the first seasonal to leave Granite Peak early. The lookout before him, a woman named Deb Carlin, lasted until mid-August before she requested evacuation. And before Deb, a man named Tomas Reyes made it to the end of July. 3 consecutive postings, 3 mid-season departures. I let that settle. Did they report the same things? Similar. Sounds on the structure at night. A feeling of being observed. I don't have their exact words. Deb spoke to me briefly, and Tomas filed a written statement with HR that I wasn't given access to. But the commonality was enough that I raised it with the regional office. And they sent a structural engineer to inspect the tower in the off-season. His report said the frame was sound, no unusual stress points, no wildlife damage beyond normal wear. Recommended routine maintenance and monitoring. She exhaled. I can have a helicopter to you in 4 hours if you want to come out. I don't. Then keep your check-ins on schedule and call me the moment that changes. I said I would. I hung up. 3 lookouts in 3 years, all driven off by the same thing. None of them had stayed long enough to find out what it was. I sat with it that evening. All of it. The scratch marks and the smell and the staircase and the radio and the photograph and the logbook and Carol's quiet revelation about 3 consecutive abandonments. I laid it out in my mind the way I'd lay out a fire map. Terrain, fuel, weather, behavior. And I looked for the decision. I should have left. Any rational assessment of the situation said leave. An unidentified presence was physically interacting with my structure on a nightly basis, and 3 people before me had encountered the same thing, and every one of them had chosen to go. That's not nothing. That's a pattern. And patterns in the backcountry are usually worth respecting. But I didn't want to leave. And the reason, when I was honest enough to look at it, had very little to do with courage or duty or stubbornness. Since Davis died, I had been numb. Not sad, numb. The grief was there. I knew it was there. The way you know there's water in a well without being able to reach it. I went through the motions of mourning. I said the right things in the therapist's office. I attended the memorial. I answered Karen's card. But none of it touched me. None of it broke through the insulation I'd wrapped around myself in the minutes after the burnover, when I'd realized Davis was gone, and the only way to keep functioning was to stop feeling. The tower had changed that. Not all at once, not dramatically, but something about what was happening on that staircase every night. The realness of it, the immediacy, the way it demanded my full attention, had cracked the numbness. For the first time in 14 months, I was present. Not managing, not coping, present. I was afraid. Let me be clear about that. What was happening was not normal, and it was not explainable, and I was afraid of it. But the fear was clean. It was direct. It was the simplest, most honest emotion I'd felt since the day I watched the fire take my best friend, and I was not ready to give it up. So I stayed. Not because I was brave, because I was. For the first time since August 14th of the year before, actually feeling something. And the prospect of going back to the numbness was more frightening than anything on that staircase. The 15th night. I'd been counting without meaning to, marking the days in the logbook, with a small line at the end of each entry, like someone scratching a tally on a cell wall. I didn't think of it that way at the time. I thought of it as record-keeping. Looking back, I think I was counting down. The preparations had become a ritual, and like all rituals, they carried more meaning than their practical function warranted. I positioned the propane lantern on the table, wick trimmed, fuel full, so it would burn for at least 8 hours. Flashlight on the shelf beside the cot. Batteries tested that afternoon. Camera on the table, though I had no intention of setting it up outside again. The logbook open to a fresh page, pen beside it. I made dinner early. Rice and canned stew, eaten at the table while the sun was still above the ridge. I washed the pot and the bowl and put them away. I swept the floor, though it didn't need sweeping. I did not barricade the trapdoor. I had thought about it. The trapdoor was a simple hatch, plywood reinforced with a steel frame, hinged on one side, with a latch that could be secured from inside. A few screws and a board across it would have made it effectively impassable. But something stopped me. Call it intuition. Call it the same part of me that had recognized the fear as clean and honest. Whatever was coming up those stairs had been coming for 3 seasons at least, and it had never forced entry. It climbed, it waited, and every person before me had refused to let it arrive. I wanted to know what happened when it did. The sun dropped. The light went gold, copper, violet. The valley disappeared. The windows turned to mirrors, and I was alone in a small, bright box at the top of the world. And below me, the dark gathered like water filling a basin. I turned the chair to face the trapdoor. I sat down. I folded my hands in my lap. And I waited. 9:14. The radio, powered off, switched down, no batteries in the backup, emitted the tone. Low, steady, that subsonic oscillation that I could feel in my back teeth and in the bones of my wrists. It rose from the speaker like a breath, like the sound the earth might make if it were exhaling. And it held. Then the staircase. The first creak was deeper than usual, or maybe I was simply more attuned to it. It came from the bottom of the structure, not the 7th stair this time, but lower, as though tonight whatever was climbing had decided to start from the ground. I felt the vibration travel through the frame, up through the floor, into the legs of my chair. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. I sat very still. My hands were in my lap and I watched them, and was surprised to find they weren't shaking. My heartbeat was elevated but steady. I was afraid, yes. Afraid in the clear, clean way I'd come to recognize. But I was also focused in a way that felt almost professional. This is what I do, I thought. I observe, I document, I stay in position, and I watch. The climbing continued past the first flight. The rhythm didn't change. 3 and 3, methodical, unhurried. Each creak was distinct, individual, like footfalls on a trail. Not the cascading groan of thermal contraction. Not the random pops and ticks of settling wood. This was sequential. This was ascending. This was something with weight and intention moving upward through my tower, with the patience of a thing that had done this many times before. It reached the landing, the place where it always stopped. I held my breath. It didn't stop. The next creak came from above the landing, from the second flight, and the sound was closer now, not below me, but beside me. The vibration sharper, the timbre voice of the staircase shifting from bass to tenor as the source approached. 3 beats. Pause. Each pause felt longer than the last, as though whatever was climbing was giving me time. Time to run, time to lock the hatch, time to decide. I didn't move. The catwalk groaned, a long, slow complaint of metal and wood bearing a weight they weren't designed for. Not heavy, not the weight of a bear or a man, but a different kind of weight. Denser, more concentrated. The sound of mass without volume. Then the footsteps were on the catwalk itself. I could track them through the northwest windows, not by sight, because the dark was absolute, but by the sequence of creaks moving along the walkway toward the trapdoor side of the cab. The radio tone swelled. The lantern flame, which had been steady all evening, began to pulse. Not flicker, pulse, as though the air in the cab was being compressed and released in a slow rhythm that matched the footsteps. The trapdoor shuddered, not violently, not like something was trying to break through. It shuddered the way a door shudders when someone on the other side places their hand flat against it and presses gently. A test, a question, a request for entry. The temperature dropped, not gradually, not the way night air cools. This was sudden and localized, as if someone had opened a window into January. I could see my breath. The condensation on the lantern glass began to frost at the edges, and the trapdoor began to rise. It opened slowly, an inch, two. The hinge didn't creak. It was as if the hardware had been silenced, as if whatever was opening the hatch existed in a relationship with the physical world that allowed it to move through materials without provoking the usual friction and resistance. The cold poured through the gap like water through a crack in a dam, and with it came the smell, sap and copper, so strong now that it coated the back of my throat and sat on my tongue like a taste. I couldn't move. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. I was not paralyzed by fear. I was not frozen in the way that people describe when they mean they were too scared to act. I was physically unable to move. My body had become a fixed object, as rooted to the chair as the chair was to the floor. My eyes worked, my lungs worked. My mind was clear and present, and recording everything with a fidelity that I would later find almost cruel. But my muscles were not mine. The trapdoor reached its full arc and rested against the cab floor with a soft thud. The opening was a square of pure black, darker than the dark outside, as though whatever occupied the stairwell below absorbed light rather than merely existing in its absence. It came through the opening. I don't have the right words for this. I've tried, in the months since, to find language adequate to what I saw, and everything I come up with sounds like something from a story, and this was not a story. This was a thing that happened to me in a room where I was sitting. It was tall. That was the first and most persistent impression, a height that seemed wrong for the space, as though the cab's 7-foot ceiling should have been an obstacle but wasn't. It was narrow the way I'd seen in the photograph, but worse in 3 dimensions. A body plan that my visual cortex kept trying to resolve into something recognizable and failing. Limbs that were too long, joints that articulated at angles I couldn't track. A silhouette that shifted at the edges, not blurred exactly, but indeterminate, as though it existed at a resolution slightly lower than the world around it. It stood in the corner of the cab, the northwest corner, the same orientation as the scratched beam below, the same direction the smell always concentrated. It did not approach me. It did not gesture or vocalize or move after taking its position. It simply stood there, and its presence filled the room the way a sound fills a room, not by occupying space, but by changing the quality of the space it was in. The air was thick, not humid, thick, like trying to breathe at altitude, like the oxygen had been partially replaced by something else. The lantern flame burned low and blue at its edges. The frost on the glass was spreading. I sat in my chair and I looked at it, and it looked at me. I don't know how I knew it was looking, because I couldn't identify features. No face, no eyes, nothing that corresponded to a sensory organ I could name. But attention has a pressure, and I have felt it before. On the fire line, when conditions shift and the fire becomes aware of you, not literally, not with intelligence, but with a directional focus that every firefighter knows in their gut, even if they'd never describe it that way. This was that. Focused, patient, aware. I don't know how long it lasted. Time had stopped being reliable the moment the trapdoor opened. It could have been 5 minutes. It could have been an hour. The lantern burned and the cold held and the shape stood in the corner, and I sat in my chair, and between us there was a silence so complete that it felt like a conversation. It began without a beginning. There was no moment I could identify as the start. No sound, no shift in the room, no signal from the shape in the corner. One moment there was only the silence, and the next moment there was Davis. Not his presence, not his ghost, not some apparition standing in the room alongside the other thing. His voice. Except it wasn't exactly his voice either. It was the pattern of his voice, the rhythm, the cadence, the way he would string words together on the fire line, short, clipped phrases with specific emphasis on the operative words, the way all good sawyers communicate when the saw is running and the noise makes everything else impossible. Fuel load heavy on the left. Watch the snag at 2 o'clock. Picking up my cut, coming to you. Those words, that exact sequence, from a day I could place precisely. A mop-up operation in the Clearwater, 2 years before the burnover. An ordinary day, a safe day. Davis calling out conditions the way he always did. His voice flat and professional through the radio in my chest harness. But I wasn't hearing it through my ears. It was inside my head, in the space where memory lives, playing with a clarity that memory doesn't normally have. My memories of Davis had been fading for months. I'd noticed it with a dull horror, the way his face was becoming a composite rather than a photograph, the way his voice was losing its specificity and becoming a general impression of a voice. But now, in this room, with this thing standing in the corner, every detail was restored. The slight rasp in his throat from the smoke, the way he dropped his G's when he was tired, the half-breath he took between sentences. It was giving these back to me, or rather it was reaching into the place where I'd stored them and pulling them to the surface, the way you'd pull a splinter from skin. Painful, precise, necessary. More came. Not words now, but sounds. Davis laughing at something I'd said at a fire camp dinner. The specific weight of his footsteps on the crew transport. The way he cleared his throat before speaking on the radio. A tiny unconscious habit that I'd heard 10,000 times and had somehow managed to forget. And with the sounds came the feelings I'd attached to them. Warmth, safety, the particular comfort of working beside someone you trust so completely that trust isn't even a word you need. It's just the way things are. And under all of that, rising like a tide, the grief, the real grief, not the managed, medicated, therapist-approved version I'd been performing for 14 months. The raw thing, the actual wound. The shape in the corner hadn't moved, but I understood now what it was doing, or what it was allowing to happen. It wasn't mimicking Davis. It wasn't pretending to be him, or using his voice to manipulate me. It was excavating, digging down through the layers of numbness and coping and avoidance to the place where I'd buried everything I couldn't afford to feel, drawing it up, drawing it out. Like venom from a wound, if venom could also be the most important thing you'd ever felt. My chest hurt, not metaphorically, actual pain, a tightness behind my sternum that made each breath feel earned. I realized I was gripping the arms of the chair so hard that my knuckles had gone white, and I couldn't let go. I didn't break all at once. It was more like ice on a lake in spring. The surface holds and holds and holds, and then one crack appears, and the crack spreads, and suddenly the whole structure that seemed so solid is just pieces floating in the thing it was trying to contain. The first crack was a sound I made, not a word. A breath that came out wrong, ragged, wet, caught in my throat like something physical. And once that sound escaped, the rest followed. I cried. I need to say that plainly, because there's no other word for it, and because I'd spent 14 months avoiding exactly this. I cried the way you cry when you've been holding your breath for so long that the exhale feels like it might turn you inside out. Quietly, not sobbing, not wailing, just a steady, helpless leak of everything I'd kept sealed, pouring down my face and dripping off my jaw. And I couldn't wipe it away because my hands were still locked on the chair. And I spoke, to the shape, to Davis, to the room. I don't remember all of it, but I remember the center of it, the thing that had been sitting at the bottom of the well since August 14th. I'm sorry I survived. 4 words. That was the whole of it. Not I'm sorry you died, because that implied it was someone's fault, and the incident review had been clear that it wasn't. Not I'm sorry I couldn't save you, because I'd done everything right, and we both knew it. I'm sorry I survived. The guilt that has no logic to it, that doesn't respond to reason or therapy or time, that exists purely as a fact of the body that is still here, still breathing, still taking up space in a world that also contains the absence of someone who should have been in it. I said it again and again, and each time it came out smaller, lighter, less like a confession and more like a statement, a fact being spoken into a room where facts were all that was left. The shape did not respond. It did not move, did not change, did not offer comfort or absolution or acknowledgement. It stood in the corner with its impossible proportions and its patient attention, and it held the space while I fell apart in it. The lantern flickered, a long, slow pulse, the flame dropping to almost nothing before recovering. The cold in the room had not changed, but something else had. The pressure, the thickness in the air was easing, gradually by degrees, like the atmospheric shift after a storm passes. At some point, I don't know when, can't identify the exact moment, I looked at the corner and it was empty. The shape was gone, not departed, not withdrawn, simply absent, as though it had never been. The corner was just a corner, the air was just air. The temperature was still cold but warming, the frost on the windows beginning to bead and run. I sat in the chair for a long time after that. My hands eventually unlocked from the armrests. My breathing slowed. The tears dried on my face and pulled the skin tight. The lantern burned steady and orange and ordinary, and outside the windows the dark was just the dark, And somewhere far below me, the tower stood in the silence, the way it had stood for decades, holding its small, bright box above the world. I woke on the floor. My cheek was pressed against the plywood, and the first thing I felt was the grain of the wood against my skin, each tiny ridge and valley magnified by the sensitivity that comes from sleep you didn't expect to have. The second thing I felt was the sun. It was coming through the east windows at a low angle, which meant early morning, 6:30, maybe 7. It was warm on my back. I don't remember moving from the chair to the floor. I don't remember falling asleep. The last thing I have is the empty corner and the sound of my own breathing in a room that had returned to being just a room, and then nothing until the sunlight and the wood grain. The trapdoor was closed, latched from the inside, the way I hadn't left it. I stared at that for a while, lying on my side on the floor, processing the implication. Either I had gotten up at some point in the night and closed it myself. Possible, I suppose, in a state of exhaustion deep enough to bypass conscious memory, or something had closed it on its way out. I got up. My body ached, the kind of ache that comes from tension held too long. My jaw, my shoulders, my hands. My eyes were swollen and my face was tight with salt. I looked, I imagined, like a man who had been through something, though what that something was, I couldn't have described in any official report. The camera sat on the table where I'd left it. I checked it, though I hadn't set it to take photographs. The memory card held only the frames I'd already reviewed, ending with the shadow on the landing. Nothing new, no record of last night. The radio was silent. I turned it on and heard only the clean hiss of the carrier wave. No tone beneath it, no oscillation, just static, normal, ordinary static. I went to the trapdoor and opened it, and leaned out over the staircase. The morning air was cool and thin and smelled like pine and stone and nothing else. No copper, no sweetness. I descended to the base and circled the tower. The scratch marks on the northwest beam were exactly as they had been the day before, no deeper, no wider, as if whatever had been making them had finished. There was no evidence. That's the thing I kept coming back to, as I stood at the base of my tower in the early light, with the valley spread out below me like a painting, and the sky clean and blue and empty. Not a single piece of physical evidence that anything had happened in the night. Just a man standing alone with a swollen face and a body that hurt and a feeling in his chest that he hadn't felt in 14 months. Something between emptiness and relief. Something that might, with time, become peace. I climbed back up and made coffee and sat at the table with the logbook open. The procedural part was easy. I wrote it the way I'd written every entry since my first day. Date, time, conditions, observations. August 23rd, night watch. Unusual auditory phenomena reported in previous entries continued and intensified. No fire activity observed. Equipment nominal. Weather clear. No action required. That was the official record. That was what dispatch would see, what Carol would see, what the file would hold. Clean, factual, adequate. The kind of boring, correct documentation that I'd built my career on. Then I opened Sean Purcell's logbook. I turned to the last entry, July 19th. It knows I can hear it, and I looked at those words for a long time. I thought about Sean sitting where I was sitting, feeling what I'd been feeling, and making the only decision that seemed rational, leaving, getting out. putting distance between himself and something he couldn't understand. I picked up my pen and wrote beneath his final words, in my own handwriting, the only thing I knew for certain. It doesn't want you to leave. It wants you to stop pretending you're fine. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what the thing in the corner wanted, or if wanting is even a concept that applies to it. I don't know if it was helping me, or feeding on me, or simply existing in a way that my presence had activated. I don't know anything about it at all, really, except what it did. And what it did was stand in my room while I finally grieved. I closed the logbook and put it back behind the firefinder cabinet in the same spot where Sean had left it. If there was another lookout after me, and there would be, they'd find it or they wouldn't. And if they did, maybe what I'd written would help. Or maybe they'd read it and think I'd lost my mind, the way I'd thought about Sean. Either way, it was there. A record. Not official, not procedural, but true. I picked up the satellite phone that afternoon. The sky was high and clean, one of those September preview days, when the light starts to go golden earlier than you expect, and the air has a clarity that feels almost surgical. Carol, it's Elliot. Elliot. I could hear her posture change. The way she said my name had a careful quality to it, as though she'd been waiting for this call and had rehearsed several versions of the conversation. How are you doing? I'm going to finish the season. Silence, a long one, even by Carol's standards. I heard a bird on her end. A Stella's jay, probably. That harsh blue call they make from the Ponderosa outside the district office. Good, she said, and her voice had something in it that I hadn't heard before, something that sounded like relief, but deeper than that, something like recognition. Carol, the other lookouts, the ones who left, did they all describe the same thing? She took her time answering. I'd come to understand that Carol's pauses weren't hesitation, they were precision. She was choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Similar enough, she said. The sounds at night, on the structure, the feeling of something present. Deb Carlin told me she heard footsteps on the stairs every night for 2 weeks. Thomas described something standing outside the cab. Sean, well, you've read Sean's notes, I imagine. I found his logbook. I figured you might. He was a meticulous kid. Another pause. They all heard the climbing. They all felt the presence. And they all left before it reached the top. The sentence hung between us, its implication as clear and cold as the air outside my windows. None of them stayed long enough to let it in, I said. No. Carol's voice was quiet, measured. None of them did. She didn't ask me what had happened. She didn't ask if something had come through the trap door or what I'd seen or felt. Maybe she already knew, in the way that people who've managed that tower for years know things without having experienced them directly. Or maybe she understood that some things exist outside the vocabulary of incident reports and personnel files. Finish strong, she said, and come see me when you're back in town. I will. And Elliot, thank you for staying. September came in cool and dry. The fire danger dropped as the nights lengthened, and the morning dew sat heavier on the grass, and the drainages exhaled their moisture in slow silver fogs that burned off by 10. My last 3 weeks on the mountain passed with a quietness that felt different from the silence I'd arrived in. The staircase was still at night. I lay in my cot and heard nothing but the ordinary complaints of an aging structure adjusting to the cold. the creaks and ticks I'd known from the beginning, stripped now of the menace I'd once projected onto them. The radio carried only static and Linda's schoolteacher voice and the mundane data of weather and fire conditions. No tone, no oscillation. The scratch marks on the northwest beam stayed exactly as they were, neither deepening nor healing, like a scar that has settled into its final shape. I don't know if the thing was gone. I don't think gone is the right word. I think it had finished, the way a process finishes, not by departing but by completing. Whatever transaction had taken place between us on the 15th night, it was done, and the tower returned to being what it had always been during the daylight hours. A room with a view, a job, a place to sit with yourself. And I did sit with myself. That's what changed. Not the tower, not the mountain, not the quality of the silence. Me. For 3 weeks I did my job, and ate my meals and read my books and watched the drainages for smoke that never came. And in the evenings I sat on the catwalk and let myself think about Davis without flinching. Not processing, not managing, not performing the therapeutic exercises I'd been prescribed. Just thinking about him, remembering him, letting the grief be present in the room the way you let a guest be present, acknowledged, accommodated, given space. It didn't stop hurting. I want to be clear about that, because I'm not telling you a story about healing. The grief didn't resolve, it didn't diminish, but it changed shape. It went from a locked door I couldn't get through to a room I could walk into and walk out of. It went from the thing I was running from to the thing I was carrying. And carrying it, it turned out, was something I could do. The last day was September 15th. I woke early, earlier than usual, before the sun cleared the ridge, and lay in the cot listening to the tower one final time. Every sound was familiar now. Every creak and tick and groan was a note in a composition I'd learned by heart over 31 days, and I let it play through once more before I got up. I packed methodically, clothes, camera, personal gear. I left the logbooks in their places, the official one in its designated spot on the shelf, Sean's hidden behind the firefinder. I cleaned the cab, swept the floor, wiped the windows, left the Osborne sighted on the same bearing I'd used for my first practice reading, back on day 1. I took one last observation and radioed it in. Linda acknowledged it and then said, "Safe travels, Granite Peak. It's been good working with you." I told her the same. Then I shouldered my pack and opened the trapdoor and stepped onto the stairs. The descent was slow, partly because the pack was heavy and the stairs were steep, and partly because I was paying attention to each tread, each railing, each bolt and joint and board, in a way I never had on the way down before. This staircase, which I'd climbed and descended dozens of times, which I'd taped and photographed and listened to in the dark, it was just a staircase. Wood and steel and hardware, built by someone who'd long since retired or died, maintained by people who would never know what climbed it after dark. I stopped on the midpoint landing, the place where it always used to stop, where Sean's logbook entries ended, and Deb Carlin's fear began, and Thomas Reyes's tolerance ran out. I stood there and looked up at the cab above me, and down at the ground below me, and I was in between, the way I'd been in between all summer, between grief and recovery, between rationality and something else, between the man who came up the mountain and the man who was going down. I placed my hand on the railing. The wood was warm, not sun-warm. The landing was in shadow at this hour. Warm the way living things are warm. the way a hand you've been holding retains heat even after you let go. I stood there for a moment. Then I continued down, and I did not look back at the cab. The trail took 2 days, same as going up. I walked through the subalpine fir and the lodgepole and the old-growth cedar, and I forded the creek at the same crossing where I'd filled my bottles in June. And I came out at the trailhead on a Tuesday afternoon to find the world exactly as I'd left it. Cars in the gravel lot. A family unloading a cooler at a picnic table. The distant sound of a highway. I'm telling you this from a place that is, by most measures, a long way from that tower. Months have passed. I went back to work. Not on a fire crew, not yet, but in the district office, doing planning and coordination. I see Carol twice a week. I started talking to a therapist again. A different one. And this time when she uses words like grief and process, I don't just nod. I tell her things. Real things. Things that happened in the dark. I haven't told her about the shape in the corner. I'm not sure I ever will. Not because I think she'd judge me or doubt me, but because what happened in that room doesn't fit inside the language of therapy any more than it fits inside an incident report. It happened in a space between categories, and that's where it lives. I don't know what visited me. I've stopped trying to name it. I've considered every possibility you're probably considering right now. Psychological break, grief hallucination, infrasound, isolation psychosis, the accumulated stress of a traumatized mind, finally discharging in the only way it could. Any of those might be true. All of them might be partially true. None of them quite account for the scratch marks on the beam, or the tape broken from above, or the shadow in the photograph, or 3 other people in 3 other years, hearing the same footsteps on the same stairs. What I know is what it did, not what it was. And what it did was climb, patiently, every night, 3 steps at a time, ascending towards someone who was suffering and didn't know it, or knew it and couldn't admit it, and waiting, on the landing, on the catwalk, at the door, for permission to enter. The others ran. I don't blame them. Running is rational. Running is the correct response when something you can't explain is moving through the dark toward you. But I was already running when I came to the mountain. I'd been running since August 14th. And the tower, or the thing in the tower, showed me the only thing I needed to know, which is that some things climb toward you in the dark not to harm you, but to make you stop. I carry the grief now, willingly, the way you carry a pack on a long trail, heavy but balanced, distributed across the body, part of the weight that keeps your feet on the ground. Davis is in it. The burn-over is in it. The sound of the fire and the silence after, and the 14 months of numbness, and the 15 nights of climbing, and the one night when I finally let something reach me. I carry it down every mountain. I'll carry it until I can't. And if you ever find yourself in a tower on a ridge, alone in the dark, and you hear something on the stairs, don't run. Sit down, be still, and let it climb.